In 1903, at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, Orville and Wilbur Wright for the first time put into powered flight a heavier-than-air machine and called it an airplane. It turned out to be one of those giant leaps for mankind, recorded in the history books of every grade school in the United States. And the names of the Wright brothers are known by every fifth grader who passed history. That was in 1903. And anyone born in 1903 knows that that's a short time ago. But during that short time, the airplane has come a long way. And it took an awful lot of leaps to get from there to here. Maybe not so giant as that first one, but giant nevertheless. And each of the leaps that was taken was first taken in somebody's mind.
I was sitting there with my feet up on the desk, mulling over just what the devil I had. And I remember I had the idea, and I went rushing into my boss, and I said, "Hey, look at this."
I do my best thinking about 3 o'clock in the morning. I have a notebook by the side of the bed. I write it down so I don't forget it.
By the time the fellows in Seattle could get around to telling the people who had the airplane to not test it, they had already tested it, and it worked.
Their names may not get included in the fifth grade history books. But now that our nation is in its 3rd century, it seems fitting that a few unsung people should get themselves sung. Gravity is pulling us down. Gravity is grave. Gravity is a downer. Flying is up. Flying is a high. Flying is a release from gravity. Flying is the ultimate leap for joy. Flying is freedom. Flying is wings. Let's look at just a few of the things that had to happen, and a few of the people who thought of them.
I always was interested in how airplane wing shapes were devised, where they came from, what considerations made people choose the shapes they chose. I had a chance to talk to Orville Wright about that when I knew him. And Orville Wright considered it a practical matter of wind tunnel experiment.
Eastman Jacobs was in charge of the wind tunnel experiments at Langley Field in Virginia during the 30s. He worked for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the NACA, predecessor of NASA. Eastman Jacobs worked on wings. A wing can lift an airplane just by moving through the air. So that's the first order of business, to get the plane moving. But that's the story of engines. First the piston engines turning propellers, and then the jet engine. If this film were about engines, we'd be talking about the problems the engine designers had to overcome to make engines more powerful. But it's about wings. And Eastman Jacobs' job was to make those wings as efficient as possible so that they could lift heavier airplanes, and so that the engines could move the planes through the air faster and cheaper. And that meant reducing the wing's drag. Drag is one of those rare technical words that also happens to be very descriptive. Drag is a real drag. It's the resistance the air sets up against the moving plane. It's the force pushing your hand back when you put it out the window of a fast-moving car, or pushing against that parachute to stop the plane. So wing designers have always had their work cut out for them to maintain the lift and decrease the drag. One of the first steps was to get rid of all those wires on the early planes and replace them with struts. The drag went down because there were fewer struts, and the struts themselves could be streamlined. The next big step, once we learned enough about wing structures to make wings light and still strong, was to get rid of the struts. And then the job was to reduce the drag in the wings themselves.
Then, when I joined the research staff at Langley Field, what was then National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, I was put in charge of the variable density tunnel, and I saw an opportunity to do some really important investigating of the effects of various wing shapes on their performance. You could replace a wing by a thickness distribution and a curvature. And the real wing was a combination of those two things, and we devised a system that we gave NACA numbers to represent variations in these variables. So many of the airplanes in this country used those wings that were developed as part of these numbered series. Some of this work was pretty routine, and it supported basic theories that were evolved along about the same time. It was the working together of theory and an experiment that intrigued me, and the fact that we might make contributions to better airplanes.
He puts it modestly. The airfoil shapes that came out of Jacobs' work in the 1930s and early 40s are used in the wings of the commercial airplanes flying today. The airfoil, by the way, is the cross-sectional shape of the wing. What was happening was that aerodynamicists were busy solving wing problems, and engine men were busy making more problems for them. They kept improving their engines so that planes could fly faster. But as a plane flies faster, the drag gets higher. So the aerodynamicists had to keep redesigning the airfoil. The work went on, and the planes flew faster and faster. And then you get up to near Mach 1, the speed of sound, and suddenly there's a whole bunch of new problems. Shock waves. This is an airfoil, the cross-section of a wing, in a wind tunnel test. The shock waves are those curved black lines wiggling around near the top of the wing. As you watch, the plane's airspeed is being increased to just under Mach 1. But the air has to speed up even more to get around the upper curve on the wing. That's what lowers the air pressure above the wing and makes the plane go up. And the speeded up air actually reaches Mach 1 as it passes above the wing, even though the speed of the plane is lower. When that happens, the plane is flying at the critical speed.
And when that occurs, we get a shock wave standing here on the surface of the wing. Then that shock wave causes separation of the flow right near the surface, which we call the boundary layer. And separated boundary layers are very much like the wake behind a boat, all churned up and unsteady. Three things happen. The drag goes up abruptly, the airplane starts to shake, and the airplane becomes uncontrollable. And so airplanes have been designed not to fly at supercritical speeds.
Richard Witcomb is also a Langley Research Center man. He is presently head of transonic aerodynamics at the NASA installation. One of his major contributions to modern aircraft design is the supercritical wing.
Now, with the supercritical airfoil, we flatten off the upper surface. We don't speed the air up nearly as much. And because of that, we greatly delay the onset of the shock wave and the separation, and therefore can fly up into the supercritical range. I might mention that we have to get lift. Airplanes can't fly without lift. And we've taken away the device or the shape that gave lift to conventional airfoils. We've gotten rid of the curvature here. Now we get the lift back by a very large amount of curvature back at the trailing edge.
Richard Whitcomb's supercritical wing was developed in 1965. But let's go back to 1935, to a young German professor named Adolf Busemann, who was surprised to get an invitation to present a paper at an international technical meeting in Rome. Surprised, honored, and scared, because some of the biggest names in aerodynamics were going to be there. This is Dr. Busemann, professor emeritus at the University of Colorado, and for 16 years a NASA research scientist at Langley.
I immediately had to give my letters to the government to see that I'm invited and ask them whether I get permission. But on the other hand, of course, you had to prepare your talk too, otherwise you are a failure. And when you see all the other people who are invited and they are famous people and you are a young man, you really have to work hard enough to make it a flop.
He worked hard not to make it a flop and came up with an idea for a paper. The idea was the swept wing, the angled back wing that we see today on practically every jet in the air.
But my family remembers when I said I have a new hit. I have a new hit when I got it. And therefore it is really like almost lightning that you get the right idea. But of course, to have to prepare for that, it doesn't come out of the dark. You have to really prepare yourself and get all your experience together and ask the proper question. How do you find
Part of the experience he got together went right back to childhood.
But of course, I was born in a harbor town where we had, my father was a harbor engineer, where we had ships, and I could see the bow waves of the ships. And they are, of course, a much easier to understand thing. And therefore, by having seen enough bow waves, especially in river boats, where the wave pattern is more similar to the one of sound. In the ocean, the waves are complicated. Every wavelength has a special velocity. But in the river boats or in shallow water, you have a similar thing, but of course in 2 dimensions only, not in 3 dimensions. And when you think of a boat and you have the bow wave of the boat going sideways, you can get crazy ideas what to do with that wave, just like people who...
And Adolf Busemann's crazy idea was to use that swept-back wave, to take advantage of all that energy and line up his wings in that direction. It was all theory at the time. It couldn't be tested because they still didn't know how to make airplanes go fast enough. But it was an idea whose time finally came.
Yes, I feel I'm the father of the sweepback, and my children are nice to me.
Now let's go to 1946, when the Boeing Company, in the person of George Schuyler, currently vice president in charge of research, decided to build a swept-wing airplane. The plane was the B-47, and the first model had a problem with pitch-up. The nose of the plane wanted to rise. The voice you are about to hear is Mr. Schuyler's.
When we flew it, we found we had this problem and we had to do something about it. So then we searched high and low for schemes to solve the problem. Eventually, one of the fellows who was not working on the airplane but was working another group in the company came to the fellows and said he knew a solution to the problem that he'd got from some wind tunnel studies that some people were doing on things called vortex generators. And these had only been studied, these vortex generators had been studied in the wind tunnels to improve the characteristics of wind tunnels, but nobody ever put them on an airplane. So he was quite outspoken that we ought to try these out. And he became, nobody would believe him or listen to him, but he was a very bright guy. And he became very obnoxious in insisting that we try these. So the fellows decided, all right, they would try them. And they made up a set of them to put on the airplane and try, and at the last minute they decided no, they wouldn't test them, they would shut it off. So the airplane was some far part of the country, I believe it was down here or in Wichita for testing. And by the time the fellows in Seattle could get around to telling the people who had the airplane to not test it, they had already tested it, and it worked. So that led to a lot of other things. The next thing we discovered was that we could make the root part of the wing much thicker without losing much on high speed. It saved a lot of weight, saved the pitch-up problem, and gave us a place to put a lot more fuel inside the wing. It also gave us a place to put the landing gear inside the wing, and that was the basis on which we were able to then go back in the commercial airplanes and use landing gears mounted on the wings. It all went back to this incident with the pitch-up and the vortex generators.
That very insistent engineer was James Osborne of the Boeing Company. When airplanes got to where they could fly fast enough to cross over from subsonic to supersonic speeds, the drag problems became enormous. Well, in 1952, Richard Witcomb got a sudden flash.
I was sitting there with my feet up on the desk, mulling over just what the devil I had. And I remember I had the idea, and I went rushing into my boss, and I said, "Hey, look at this."
What it was the area rule, the rule that led to the so-called Coke bottle fuselage. Using the area rule, the fuselage, the body of the plane, is necked in at the wing. Let's let Dr. Witcomb tell it.
I was at a lecture given by Dr. Boosman in which he was describing his interpretation of transonic flow. And he made the comment that transonic flow was like a pipe fitter's flow, in that at the speed of sound, or near the speed of sound, the tubes of air, or a given amount of air going past an airplane does not contract as it does at subsonic speeds, but stays with the same cross-sectional area. And so it was like a pipe fitter's flow in the sense that if you could see air, there would be individual pipes of air going around the wing that weren't changing their shape. So I said, maybe that's, I can use that. And so I was sitting at my desk trying to put together what I had learned in the wind tunnel using the Schlern pictures and what Dr. Boosman had said. And then it was like a light bulb lighting up, as you've seen in the comic pages. Aha, that is what it is. The pipe of air that has to get around the wing, it can't change its shape. It can't get smaller to get around the wing. It's a constant area, therefore it has to bend around that wing. Now, where can it go? It probably, in general, gets pushed this way. Well, let's have it come out this way. It gets pushed out this way. And therefore, it continually is pushing more and more pipes out here. None of these pipes can change shape or cross-section. Therefore, any pipe that gets pushed out this way, the piece of pipe right next to it gets pushed out too. And so you go way out here, and these pieces of pipe are all being pushed. So what we do is to essentially neck down the fuselage in this region, make it narrower here, so that we account for the cross-sectional areas of the wing. In other words, we subtract out of the fuselage the area of the wing. Now, with the indented fuselage, that pipe doesn't have to go out this way. It can bend into the hole in the fuselage. And it doesn't affect these pipes out here. And this cuts the drag at transonic speeds in half, approximately. And that concept was then used to design all the future transonic and supersonic airplanes.
It's because of wings that an airplane goes up, but it's the whole airplane that's flying up there. And there's a designer who's got to be included in a film like this one, who has advanced the art by designing whole new airplanes, some 40 of them, during his long career at Lockheed. That includes the World War II Hudson bomber, which he redesigned, the Lockheed Lightning, the F-104, the first Air Force jet, the P-80, the U-2, and another one that we'll get to in a moment. His name is Clarence L. Johnson, but everyone knows him as Kelly Johnson. We talked to Kelly Johnson about the plane that flies at 3 times the speed of sound. The plane that flew from New York to London a few years ago in less than 2 hours. Nicknamed Blackbird and variously identified as the YF-12 and the SR-71.
Well, let's talk blackbirds in general. They're all blue, they're not black. They become black at altitude because the paint color changes. We thought we knew all about titanium, and we needed titanium to fly either titanium or stainless steel. The B-70 went the stainless steel route and went the honeycomb route, and I didn't think we were smart enough to do that. So we went the titanium route. We thought we knew all about titanium. We had researched it for 10 years. But out of the first 6,000 titanium pieces we made, 99% were scrapped. They were so brittle, you'd push them off the table and they'd shatter. So we said, well, we'd better start over again. We had to, for instance, invent a hydraulic oil that would stand at an operating temperature of 600 degrees Fahrenheit. It came about that we had to invent almost everything on the airplane. I posted a $50 reward to anybody that could come up with anything easy to do on the Blackbird. I still got the $50. We had help on the metallurgy course from the Titanium Corporation of America, but in adapting it to practice, we had to do that. We had to set up a machine shop and determine the best drills, milling cutters, all the rest of it. We actually, in that program, ended up with 67 vendors making us individual machine parts. And so we had to pass on to them, so optimum tools and other things. Our operating temperatures, the average for the whole airplane when we were cruising is about 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The strip between the windshield pieces right in front of the pilot's face is running 750 degrees. And the bottom of the rudder, which is above the afterburner, is running 900 to 1200 degrees. And the problem of handling those temperatures, the inlet temperature to for the air going into the engine gets over 800 degrees Fahrenheit. That's what I say, we had to invent everything. Well, I do my best thinking about 3 o'clock in the morning. I have a notebook by the side of the bed. I write it down so I don't forget it. Start at 7 o'clock and quit at 4. If you can't do it with brains, you can't do it with hours. I don't try to impress my metabolism, though, on the others. If they want to come in at 9 and go home at 6, that's up to them.
Kelly Johnson's Blackbirds were flying at Mach 3 15 years ago. And for the past 15 years, that seems to have satisfied just about everyone as being fast enough. Now we're looking at new problems. And one of the biggest is economic.
Well, the airlines, of course, are in deep trouble because the cost of their fuel has gone up 2, 3, 4 times in several years. So they're very anxious to do something about this. So then the question comes, all right, can we design a different engine? Can we design a different wing? Can we design a different cabin to put the passengers in that would save fuel? And all of these things are being very seriously considered now. Most of them are things which require a brand new airplane to make much progress on, and there haven't been any new airplanes designed in recent years.
You can see that this is an add-on type of thing that you could put onto the existing airplanes and thus save fuel for the entire operating fleet of transports, military and commercial.
Dr. Witcomb's idea is the winglet.
Out at the tip of the wing, we have a more negative pressure on the upper surface because we have lift, and a more positive pressure on the lower surface. And therefore, the air tends to move inward into that low pressure region on the upper surface. And finally, because of that motion, downstream of the airplane, we have a vortex. At this point, this thing is trying to start a vortex. A vortex is just like a tornado. There is a drag associated with that vortex. The vortex is an energy loss which must have a drag associated with it. And the winglets are devices to reduce the strength of that vortex and therefore reduce the drag. The way I like to describe how the drag reduction occurs is that these little winglets are operating just like a sailboat tacking upwind.
We asked Dr. Witcomb what he expected from the winglet if all goes well.
The first step, in fact, the reason for developing these was to develop something that could be used on existing airplanes. And you can see that this is an add-on type of thing that you could put onto the existing airplanes and thus save fuel for the entire operating fleet of transports, military and commercial. This is where I think it'll first be used. But on the other hand, my calculations indicate anyway, it will be on every airplane in the future because it is so much more efficient than an airplane without it.
There have been a lot of people who have been responsible for the evolution of the airplane. We've talked about only a few of them. But before we conclude, let's take time to listen to the late Igor Sikorsky, the inventor of the helicopter. This is from an interview filmed in 1967.
Well, certainly, the question of teamwork entered now to a greater extent than it entered before. And this is both in science and perhaps in every other branch of technique. Nevertheless, I am convinced that the work of the individual still remains a very important factor, still remains a spark which moves mankind ahead, even more than teamwork. Teamwork comes into existence after the spark, the intuitive spark of a living man started something. Then later comes the teamwork to give a bigger body to the little soul which he created. So briefly, to my mind, creative work is still there with us, still there to stay, and still remain a tremendously important factor in the progress of mankind.
And then it was like a light bulb lighting up, as you've seen in the comic pages. Aha! That is what it is.
But my family remembers when I said I haven't knew it when I got it.
Well, I do my best thinking about 3 o'clock in the morning. I have a notebook by the side of the bed. I write it down so I don't forget it.
It was the working together of theory and an experiment that intrigued me, and the fact that we might make contributions to better airplanes.